pork butchery is turning a carcass into cuts that are more usable in a home kitchen in a smaller scale, in quantities that you can handle. And if you pursue totally single-mindedly and perfectly the motive for creating useful, utilitarian cuts, you will stumble upon the beauty. And similarly, if you cut it to be as beautiful as possible, you will stumble into utility. They can't be separated. They are, form is function and function is form, if you're following the traditional methods. And I think that's sublime. And that's why it's just something that you can spend a lifetime learning and generations developing knowledge around.
The times were hard, and Ebenezer was not a rich man. He lived with his family in a house that his father's father's grandfather had built with his own 2 hands and a sturdy rock. The fields surrounding his house were lush with wheat and the orchards full of apples. Ebenezer's hogs were fat from wandering the deep forest that stood between his house and the rest of the world. Every year, after the long season when the sun grew weary and the noontimes crisp, Ebenezer's family and friends would gather to harvest his hogs. And though his land was fertile and water plentiful, there were few sources of flesh and fat for Ebenezer's family. In those days, a sturdy hog was insurance against the elements. They began with the sun on this day of labor and feast, and although the outside temperature ensured the pork would not spoil, the group worked quickly to cut, cook, and cure the entire pig. By supper time, their work was done. Ebenezer slept well that night, knowing his family would eat well this winter. Ebenezer's methods are the function of a tradition, which is a ritual or belief passed down through time within a society with origins in the past. But from where have those origins come? The development of any species worth its weight in pogs begins with devising mechanisms to satisfy the fundamental necessities of existence. The solutions to these challenges are necessarily based upon the circumstance of geographic location, and are therefore built upon the natural composition of that place. In this way, regionally specific habits evolved, or one could call them cultures. It was thus, from the limitations of the land, that Ebenezer's ancestors formed their methods of hog husbandry and slaughter. Years later, Ebenezer's grandson Francois opened a butcher shop in the nearby town where he slaughtered and butchered animals. While his knowledge was deep and hands adroit, Francois's move to town had changed his relationship to pigs from subsistent to that of a tradesman. He now exchanged expertise for money. Francois's son, grandson, great-grandson, and great-great-grandson, Augustus, were all butchers in that same shop. One day, a curious new store opened up in town that self-proclaimed excellence and sold cuts of meat packaged in plastic. Over the next few years, Augustus's customers slowly but surely began never coming back. On the day that he closed the shop forever, Augustus wondered what kind of special meat they were selling, and more importantly, from where had it come? In the early 16th century, Spanish colonist Hernando de Soto sailed from Cuba to Florida in the company of 13 sows and 2 potent Iberian boars. They marched west towards the Mississippi, leaving droves of hogs in their wake. Successive waves of settlers soon discovered the wonders of an endemic and prolific cereal in the Midwest. Hogs fed on sweet corn were fatter than ever and tasted like candy. As the Midwestern hog populations grew exponentially, our resourceful capitalist forebears had the vision to consolidate and centralize the service of slaughtering and butchering their bountiful corn-fed hogs. Chicago's Union Stockyard opened in 1865 and processed the Midwest's 50,000 hogs at the time. And although they came from small farms, the exodus of traditional processing knowledge was nearly complete. 100 years later, the Iowa beef packers opened their first slaughterhouse 500 miles west of Chicago. They enacted a Fordist model of production which limited workers to one repetitive task, and integrated the slaughtering and butchering processes with a facility that absorbed live animals and discharged small cuts of meat. By the late 1960s, the trade of the butcher had effectively been rendered useless. Augustus's great-grandson Wentworth moved to the big city as a child. When he was a grown-up, Wentworth worked in a very tall office building and visited the doctor frequently. On the days he felt adventurous, he would eat his lunch on the bench outside next to the oak tree. One crisp Tuesday, he noticed a swanky new butcher shop had opened down the street. When he walked in, the rich and static aromas of fresh pork filled his nostrils. The tiles on the wall, the marble counters, and cured meat were all oddly comforting. And though he was unsure why, he was reminded of a story his grandfather once told him.
What are the tools that are necessary to butcher a pig?
The necessary tools for butchery of a pig in a home setting are, I guess, just 4 tools. One of them is a bone saw. One of them is a cleaver, and then the 2 knives would be a boning knife and a larger knife, in this case a straight steak knife. With those 4 tools, you can break down a whole pig quite proficiently and beautifully. There's a real loss of that knowledge is how to simply break down a half of a pig into quarters, but it's very simple. Before quartering the pig, a few things have to be removed. Leaf fat. The last thing to remove before you quarter the carcass is the tenderloin. I start by removing some of the fascia. Then I begin working my fingers in the direction of the head, along the seam. You'll encounter some tougher membranes. The further back you go, and that's when you would come in with your knife once you've got the whole tenderloin free. Now we're going to remove the leg quarter from the loin and the belly. The leg includes everything from this vertebrae over. You would follow the spine right when it takes this hard angle to move up to the tail. It's 1 vertebra towards the head from that angle. We're going to make this cut in the disc of the spine, and we'll be able to cut halfway into the spine. And I just project a straight line directly from that disc all the way across. I've cut away all of the meat. I can just flip it up and then pull it away. The leg quarter. Now we will remove the shoulder quarter. The line I choose is at the end of the sternum because I know I can cut through the cartilaginous tip of the sternum. And I'm going to go in between these ribs, and it's important that I match up with a vertebrae. One thing you may run into are the feather bones back here. They're very thin, so you can usually just cut right under them. You can just tip it up. Get your shoulder quarter. What remains is the loin and the belly quarter. So in order to make this cut, I first determine how big I want my rib chops to be. So that'll be my starting point. And I'll make a corresponding line on the other side. You can see the cartilaginous tip of the pelvis where we separated the leg from the loin. And so we'll just go to one side of that tip on the belly side. Now I just have to connect those dots. And the key is to only cut meat with a knife, never with a saw. So I've cut away all of the meat so that the saw is only cutting bone. Now we have the belly and the loin.
Can you move that milk crate?
So now I'm going to separate the sirloin from the leg. I'm going to just separate it into some roasts to demonstrate one way that it could be prepared. What remains is the top of the sirloin. I'm going to remove the tail right in between the vertebrae. So to cut it in half, I'm just going to go straight through the middle here and just make some roasts. It's fine in the middle. Come in with the creamer. It's a sirloin roast. With the leg of pork, we can come in to remove the trotter, the hock, and then we're going to take the leg into 2 large roasts. Trotter. There's the pork hock. My favorite way to cut these is very simple. I'm just going to go to one side of the marrow bone here and just follow that line completely straight all the way down to the table. So boneless leg roast, and this is going to be a bone in. This is the belly. We're going to remove the spare ribs to give us the beautiful bacon. Spare ribs. We're just going to cut it in half so it will fit in a smoker. This is the loin. You have the ribs and the loin. We're going to take off the skin and the back fat along this seam. You're going to dig your fingers in and keep them angled up towards the back fat. This is separating the back fat from the fat that is directly on the meat. Back fat. So in order to get rib chops, start at the top of the rib, and the only thing I'm thinking about is making my cut parallel with the previous cut I'm not even worried about how thick the chop is. I'm going to let the rib determine the thickness of the chop. Now we're just going to extract this loin muscle. This is a pork shoulder. This is how you butcher it. Voila! This is shoulder. And bend the trotter. You can count 1, 2 on the second joint. That's where we're going to come in. Bigfoot. For the large front hock, we're going to divide it into 3. You're going to want to feel for the elbow and go above it. We're going to separate the shoulder into the Boston and the picnic. That we have the picnic and the Boston. So first with the picnic, I'm going to work this seams, leaving some meat on the ribs. So first I'm going to extract the scrag end. Then I'm going to come here and make a boneless roast. And I'm choosing this cut to be right at the tip of the shoulder blade. Now we're left with the bone that runs down to the leg and a bit of the shoulder blade up here. We're just going to go straight in half.
picnic shoulder roast. So this is the Boston. Clean up the side where the sticking cut was made. So we're gonna make roast every 3 vertebrae. Boston butt.
At least for me, that is part of my inspiration, and what we love to spread is the redemptive value of the meat that is dead. It comes alive on your table. The redemptive power of meat to bring life again is amazing. It's contradictory because you kill an animal and it would otherwise decompose and feed the earth. But if we could intentionally and thoughtfully harvest that dead animal, the abundance of life that proceeds from it is shocking. You know, it's the notion that wealth is not a finite quantity. It's not like you're going to run out. It is so abundant. You're creating it. There's enough to share. You have to share. And I think the only way to unlock that abundance is to extricate ourselves from conventional notions of the way we're cooking meat today and embrace and look back and remember the ways that it was prepared before.